This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Burra Charter. It's a document that I'm sure is familiar to all of us on some level. I speak as a practitioner and I don't make any claims to be able to recite it article for article, but I do recognise that the principles promoted in the Charter underpin pretty much every aspect of what I do. There is, I think, a really compelling clarity and simplicity to the Burra Charter process, that necessarily sequential regime of gathering evidence, analysis of evidence, assessment, and the development of policies to manage the identified values, which has become arguably the central pillar of heritage practice in Australia. I look forward to hearing from Miles Lewis on this later, but the drafting of the Burra Charter was the product of a particular set of circumstances. Australia ICOMOS was established in 1976, and one of its early initiatives was to draft a code of conduct or a guidelines framework for its members. And this was an outcome of resistance to the idea of revising the Venice Charter of 1964. There were a number of delegations to the 1978 ICOMOS General Assembly in Moscow, including the Australian delegation, which considered that the Venice Charter was of limited assistance in assisting the preservation of vernacular buildings, industrial complexes, farms, gardens. It was a charter that was overtly focused on grand monuments. The resistance to revision was because it was felt that the Venice Charter was itself a monument and shouldn't be altered. And so Miles came back to Australia and recommended that a charter should be drafted relevant to the Australian context, and as a consequence we find ourselves here today. The charter has always been broad in principle and has always been focused on building fabric. This has arguably contributed to the really strong alignment, the really fundamental alignment between heritage and architectural practice. Over time, concepts of heritage have broadened and become more plural. Social values, always part of the Charter, have come into much sharper focus in recent times, and there's now momentum for bottom-up or community-led heritage, among many other issues and aspirations. The Burra Charter has been reviewed and amended on a number of occasions to reflect evolving conceptions of heritage, the most recent major review being in 2013. And so despite these major shifts in the heritage landscape, the Burra Charter has managed to remain a constant, and I anticipate that the reasons for its enduring appeal will form part of the discussion this evening. I have nearly finished. As advertised, the format for this event is borrowed from the ABC's Q&A TV show. So Philip Goad has kindly agreed to host, moderate, and generally direct the traffic. You, the audience, will direct questions to the panel, and the panel will provide some erudite and insightful responses. To all of those who submitted questions, thank you very much for entering into the spirit of things. We have made a selection, but we're pretty confident that most of the issues raised will be addressed. This is intended to be an interactive format, so there is space for debate and discussion. If there is something you'd like to add, please make us aware. I should say that this event is being recorded. The audio will be uploaded to the Australia ICOMOS website in the next couple of days, and we also have people here taking notes. So it would be appreciated if you could state your name when posing a question or making a comment. And also for anyone wishing to live tweet or Instagram the proceedings, there's a hashtag. I've nearly finished, so two more things. The first relates to David Rankin, Professor Emeritus at this uni. As many of you will be aware, David has had a really strong, long and distinguished career working across the built and natural environments. He was for 6 years the chairman of the Australian Heritage Commission. He's been a member of the Australian National Commission for UNESCO and has represented Australia twice at World Heritage Committee meetings. We invited him to attend this evening. He sent his apologies due to poor health, but he has, however, made copies of his latest book, Valuing Australia's National Heritage, available. I understand they were only printed last week, so they really are. It's really new. They're at the back, outside. Please help yourself to a copy. For anyone who misses out or is interested in obtaining a copy, they're available online. website on the screen. And finally, some thank yous. Thank you to the Melbourne School of Design generally, and to Julie Willis, Dean of the Faculty specifically, for very generously hosting us this evening. Thanks to Lizzie Nicholson, in particular, for all assistance in working out the logistics of recording, event promotion, and chilling the wine. If you'd like to thank her in person, she'll be serving drinks outside after the event. Thanks again to all of you for attending, and thanks to the panel. I'll leave it to Philip to introduce the panel, but I'd finally just introduce Philip. For those of you who may not be aware, Philip Goad is the Chair of Architecture. He's the Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor in the University's Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. He's also co-director of the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage. He's recognised internationally for his research on Australian architecture, and he is the author or editor of countless books, including the Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture. For the 2019-20 academic year, he will be the visiting professor at Harvard University. He's been appointed as the Chair in Australian Studies at the university's Department of History of Art and Architecture. He's the first architecture expert to have been appointed to this eminent position. Philip, thank you very much, and I'll hand over to you.
So, can you all hear me? The microphone working? Great. We do have microphones, one on each side of me. I'm your Tony Jones for the evening, and there are set questions, and as per the TV show, we have some question askers variously placed around the audience. But I'm going to introduce you first to our panel this evening. So on my right is Meg Goulding, Chief Executive Officer and Principal Heritage Advisor of Ochre Imprints Proprietary Limited, a Melbourne-based practice that specialises in archaeological heritage management. She's worked in the cultural heritage industry since the late 1980s. Megan is trained in both historical archaeology and Indigenous archaeology. She's got a diverse range of experience, having worked for the state government heritage agencies in private practice and as CEO of Indigenous community-based organisations, specifically the Wurundjeri Wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation and the Taungurung Land and Waters Council. She was appointed as the archaeology member of the Victorian Heritage Council in June 2016, and she's been a sessional member at VCAT since 2012. Now, while much of Megan's work as a heritage practitioner has involved documenting and managing material remains, she's had a long-standing interest in the ways in which community attachment to place can be acknowledged and documented in the context of heritage management practice and the challenges that this poses. So please welcome Megan for this evening. On my left and your right is Helen Lardner. Helen is a registered architect and the director of Helen Lardner Conservation and Design. Her introduction to the Burra Charter was in her first year of architecture with, the person on my right, Professor Miles Lewis here at the university. And Miles later supervised Helen's Master of Architecture in Conservation. Helen is a long-time ICOMOS devotee. She was a member of the Council of the Historic Environment in Victoria when it was subsumed into Australia ICOMOS. She's currently Vice President of Australia ICOMOS, and she's serving her second stint on the Executive Committee. Since 2013, Helen has evaluated new development within World Heritage Places, and she's assessed the significance of places internationally for ICOMOS. Her expert appointments include the Australian Heritage Council, Victorian Heritage Council, and she's been a sessional member of Planning Panels Victoria. Please welcome Helen Lardner. And then up on my far left is Dr. James Lesh. James researches heritage conservation and urban history. He completed his PhD here at the University of Melbourne in 2018, and he's now a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Sydney in their School of Architecture, Design and Planning. James's research has appeared in leading international academic journals on topics including Australian heritage philosophy and also the Burra Charter. He's currently working on 2 books, a monograph, Heritage, Identity and Development in the 20th Century Australian City, and a co-edited collection with Dr. Rebecca Madgen of the University of Glasgow, which is titled Methodologies for Exploring Emotional Attachments to Historic Urban Places. And both books will be published by Routledge next year, big year. James also convened, most significantly, the very successful Our City, Our Square for Fed Square, not Apple Square, the advocacy campaign, which was extremely successful. His writing has been published in The Age, The Herald Sun and The Conversation, among other places. Please welcome James Lesh. And finally, on my right, Emeritus Professor Miles Lewis. Miles Lewis, FAHA, is an architecture historian. He's active in the International Council on Monuments and Sites and the Comité International d'Architecture Vernaculaire. And he's been a UNESCO ICOMOS referee for more than 20 World Heritage Sites. He initiated the Burra Charter following the Moscow Suzdal Conference of ICOMOS in 1978, where he led the Australian delegation, and he was subsequently one of the Charter's authors. Please welcome Miles Lewis. So let's begin. And our first question comes from Suzanne Zara. So, Suzanne. So, Miles, can you...
I think I should say a little bit about the context, first of all. In the 1970s, Australia was very much concerned with things other than just buildings. Today, we tend to think mostly about architecture. Most people here are probably architects and historians. But at the time, there was a big input from archaeology, and Judy Byrne, the archaeologist, made critical contributions to the charter itself. There was a big push for shipwrecks, especially from Western Australia, was interest in industrial sites. So we felt the Village Charter was not adequate for those things. The Village Charter uses the term monument. And quite clear from the wording, it looks at things like classical temples and Gothic cathedrals. That's really how it's all phrased. And on top of that, there's sort of United Nations rhetoric, imbued in this from the past, or pomposity. And that didn't go down well with us. So we tried to get that revised, as sort of said, and we were defeated because it was a monument in its own right. Why the Burra Charter advanced and the Village Charter has not, and the Village Charter exists of course, is that the Burra Charter is designed for use. It's designed to deal with those topics which we felt were not properly dealt with in the Village Charter. But also sets out clear concepts, particularly the concept of place. So we now are able to refer to all the environment and our structure of the structure, to look at the architectural deposits, at the surrounding landscape, anything that might be relevant to it. And secondly, the concept of significance. Defining significance clearly, so you have to think why a place is important, whether it was aesthetic, scientific, and so on, was a major contribution to the debate. And that's largely why it's lasted. And the other thing I would say about it is, because it got adopted through the patronage of David Ingham, principally, as chair of the Australian Heritage Commission, they funded the working groups that worked on the Charter. They insisted that when the first work was done on Norfolk Island, the principles of the Charter be used. It had no legal status until the Heritage Commission said, this is how it must be done. And then gradually, against the hostility of the National Trust didn't like the Charter, gradually it became accepted as being what you use for every conservation exercise.
Thanks, Miles. I'll ask some of our panels to comment. So, Helen, would you like to comment?
I'd like to add to that. Do I need to use the mic? I probably, yep. I'd like to add to that, Miles. I think one of the reasons it's lasted is because Australians have been so successful overseas as advocates for the Burra Charter. And there's been Miles himself, there's Crystal Buckley, obviously, Jane Lennon. There's a lot of people that have done very important work overseas. And what we've found is that other countries have been interested in the approach from the Burra Charter. And of course now it's been translated into numerous other languages and adopted, which I think is really terrific. I think the other key aspect, which is perhaps a difference between the Venice Charter and the Burra Charter, is, as Miles said, the Venice Charter has been seen as something set in stone, and the Burra Charter has been through development, particularly in the 1999 version, but the 2013 version as well. And so there's been an environment of it being more open to adaptation to ongoing practice in heritage conservation.
Megan, do you...
Yes, I was just going to say the same thing that Helen says, that it has been very responsive in many ways to the changing landscape, the social landscape, and participation. Particularly, I think the emphasis that I'm kind of coming with tonight is the Indigenous participation in cultural heritage management. So certainly we've seen a lot of changes, and it's managed to kind of adapt as we adapt as a society to recognising, Indigenous Australians and the importance of their cultural heritage as well, and the kind of the differences between Indigenous cultural heritage and the European kind of fabric built environment type heritage that the early versions of the Burra Charter certainly symbolised, I suppose.
James. Yeah, just pull it.
I think that kind of the key points have been made, but when I think coming at it as a more emerging professional looking at it now, I see the 1970s and to a lesser extent the 1980s as this kind of high point, because not only the profession itself emerging, but also the popular support that was behind the profession as well. There was a social movement that was in favour of it. There were residents who were out in the streets demanding that their heritage be saved. There was that kind of social aspect of it, and so that everything that had been done to conserve places in Australia, particularly what would have been we'd now consider almost monuments in themselves, older 19th century buildings, well, all of that was reconceived as well. And the Burra Charter gets that critical mass of supporters from the outset because of this kind of recreation of the profession, or the creation of the profession of heritage in Australia. No other charter has kind of ever had that kind of moment of that kind of note where everyone is together and then kind of goes out to spread it, not only in Australia, but then, of course, internationally as well. And for that to happen across government with David Yenkin and Max Burke and others, the private sector, academia, and so forth, it's just this kind of very unique Australian moment there. Add onto that the Australia ICOMOS, as we know, and as well, kind of the motivated advocates for the Charter. And it is innovative for its time. And when we look back at the Charter now, we kind of say in many ways it was the first postmodern heritage Charter. That's how it's kind of seen from abroad, looking back at Australia. So it's this kind of, you couldn't have had it, the Burra Charter in the 60s, you couldn't have had it even in the late 80s. It had to come at that specific moment in time for it to be produced and then also to prosper as well.
Now, I'm also taking answers to the same question from the floor at the back. So the question was, why has it proved so enduring? So, Chris? Right. Miles. A lot of us know, but it's okay.
Borough is, of course, the mining town in South Australia, and it shows it deliberately to contrast with Venice, to try to make a full Australian name rather than a composite nation name.
Right. Yep.
So that's where it was adopted formally.
Great. So, do we have any other answers from the floor as to why the Burra Charter has proved so enduring? Anyone feel they want to add anything new to that? No? Okay. We'll warm up as we keep going. Our next question is from Peter Lovell. He wasn't able to attend this evening, so I'm going to read his question. Since 1979, the Burra Charter has been through multiple revisions. Are there limits to acceptable change to the Charter, or should iterative evolution be recognised as part of its DNA, as part of what makes up the Burra Charter? James, do you think there is a limit to revising and revising and revising the Burra Charter?
I think it's going to be up to a lot of people in the room whether they'll kind of have another crack at it again. But I think what's clear about it as a kind of historian of the Burra Charter is that iterative evolutions are now part of the Burra Charter. It's been revised so many times, and whether we might like or agree with those evolutions, those changes or not, that's part of it. You said that before as well. That it hasn't been treated as that kind of historic monument of a charter like the Venice Charter was. But I think the challenge with these kind of evolutions is that the Burra Charter is in many ways always kind of has to link back to that kind of 1970s and 1980s moment. So each iteration really, the way that I see it, has kind of tried to further rationalise, further arrange and further kind of authorise heritage practice to deal with changing social context and changing expectations for heritage. The Charter kind of at its core, and David Yenkel was very much an advocate for this, was this kind of idea of an integrated and extensive and kind of totalising approach to heritage management, that we could do it sequentially in this particular way of going about it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just what is kind of embodied within the Charter itself. Now, I think the critical issue here, though, is that some emerging approaches, critical approaches to heritage and things that are happening internationally, perhaps jar with that kind of idea of heritage philosophy, particularly the way that professional and community expertise must intermingles through heritage practice today. So this is kind of a question that I was thinking back. Will 1979 be looked back fondly, knowing now that in 60 or 100 years is the early revolutionary moment in Australian heritage philosophy?
So, Megan, any thoughts? Can we keep altering and refining the Burra Charter?
I would say yes, because I think that's the nature of the beast, and that's being its strength. But it's really hard to predict the future, but being responsive is, I suppose, why, as I was saying before, why I feel like it's just a personal view. It's so alive today is that it has been able to evolve. So it would be a shame if it didn't. And I still think there's quite a bit of work to be done on the Indigenous front. So yeah, we'll have to evolve to some extent.
Now, Helen, you've said that acknowledged that the Charter is robust enough to take change, and you think it's indefinite?
Look, I think it has to change to keep currency, but I don't actually think that it can just go on morphing. I do think that it is in itself a document which is largely about processes and establishing ways of thinking and approaching heritage. And so, you know, we now have the suite of other practice notes that go with the Burra Charter, and I think there's a lot of room in those to grow and to develop, particularly as our industry has people with specialised areas of knowledge and different interests. The Burra Charter can't be all things to everybody. It can be a sort of underlying principle, but I think it needs to be augmented by other documents and other thinking to keep its currency because practice is changing internationally.
Mm-hmm. And Miles, as an initiator, do you hesitate?
I would endorse Helen's view. I'd be the last person to say it should be frozen and protected the way the Venice Charter was. But having said that, there have been, I think, many changes which have not improved it. Its strength is its clarity and simplicity, and the more you fiddle with it, the worse it becomes. One problem is that bodies can't adopt it, that is, planning authorities can't adopt it, because they adopt a document which can be changed by somebody else, can't be used legally. That's been a particular problem in Tasmania. I'd much rather see it stable for a period of time. The first change which I objected to was the addition of spiritual significance. There were four sorts of significance originally, which was logical. They came from the Australian Heritage Commission Act originally. Now just think about what that means in practice. When Vatican II did a big move to move the altars and churches down from the east end to the crossing, which involved changing the whole sort of way the church worked, but also changing the fabric, digging up the caustic tiles and the marble paving in the floor. Now, under the original Burra Charter, you would have said, well, these changes are, if they're inevitable, they should be reversible. So you should design it so you put a carpet down and build a timber platform and put the altar on that, don't dig the whole place up. Once you put the significance in, any change in the Catholic theology becomes part of the significance. There's no debate anymore. You just accept that change. And so you damage, in my terms, the architecture of the building. It's better to keep these things separate so they are publicly visible, and they are weighed publicly against each other, just as you weigh the conservation interest against economics or against a freeway going through a site. Those things have to be dealt with at a community physical level, and I would say the same for other sorts of significance.
So what about the need for the Charter possibly to respond more directly to intangible heritage?
Well, again, I'll be very strong on that. Intangible heritage, the expertise lies with anthropologists and ethnomusicologists and so on, not with people in this room. And we're laying a ridiculous if we claim to have the authority in those areas. Generally speaking, I think those people deal with it in a different sort of way. The link to a particular site is not important. Where there is a link, of course, I certainly support maintaining the rituals that link to a particular site or the traditions. But generally speaking, it's a whole different area, and I don't think we have any involvement in that any more than we have with, say, the museum components of the site or anything else that happens to be linked to a particular site. But not overall. It's not our area at all.
So Megan, how do you feel about this issue of intangible heritage and the Burra Charter?
Look, I think it's a huge improvement, so I probably have a different view from Miles on this stuff. But I come from a practice that is pseudo-anthropological sometimes as archaeologists. It's a limitation of our industry that we have a lot of people out there kind of recording Aboriginal cultural heritage with a kind of emphasis, I suppose, on fabric. But we're dealing on a daily basis, and I'm speaking as a non-Indigenous person. I'm not speaking for Indigenous people here, but rather from my own experience. I'd just like to qualify that. We're working with Indigenous people every day, but there's a whole raft of values that are relevant, I suppose, to the landscapes that we're recording, that is accessible from the people that are with us, working with us, Indigenous communities. And we're not necessarily recording those values, and yet they do really inform the landscapes and the cultural values, and so you get a much better understanding about people's attachment and the significance of landscapes to Indigenous people if you have the intangible values kind of angle or aspect built into those endeavours, those sort of research projects, etc. So the day-to-day kind of work that we do as archaeologists, it's virtually impossible to integrate a lot of intangible values work in our practice. But I think that sort of for broader research projects, etc., there's a really good place for it. We don't have, as you say, we don't actually have a lot of skills and development and training in those areas as we come through.
So Helen, what are your thoughts?
I just wanted to comment in relation to authenticity because I'm particularly attracted to the NARA document, which probably everyone in this room knows, but the document about authenticity of values, which really is putting the idea forward that to understand the value as the source of the information, you really need to understand what it is that has given rise to that value, and that can be in terms of skills or rituals or practices rather than just the fabric. So I'd argue with Miles, as I tried unsuccessfully to do on many occasions as a student, and say that maybe the changes in liturgical practice are in fact the basis of authenticity for some places rather than the fabric in which they are housed. And approaching the same issue from a different point of view, I work with industrial sites, and it's often a problem with industrial sites where the technology changes and that they can leave the industry behind. And in some ways, from a heritage perspective, we can go in there and say, okay, we've got an intact example of an industrial process from this period. But on the other hand, by allowing the fabric change and the technology to change, you might keep the manufacturing, for example, process going, the commitment and the community that's around that place So I think that authenticity in understanding what's important at some of these places is sometimes, well, it's there in the Burra Charter, it's definitely there, but it's sometimes hard for people to highlight because it's easier to talk about what we can see, particularly in terms of the planning scheme, you know, keep the exterior of the building, what can we see from the public sphere, that sort of thing. It can be harder to fight for the authenticity.
So, James, on intangible heritage, does the Charter need to respond more directly, or is it doing okay?
So the Charter itself says what needs to be done is to conserve the relationship between people and place. If we take the idea of place as being in itself inherently tangible and intangible, well then it's basically in the Burra Charter itself. It just comes down to how we define place. And I think the most ways the kind of people who work with contemporary ideas of place would say that we can't really make those any distinctions at all, and that they're in fact one and the same thing. So I think I agree with one.
Any thoughts from the floor on this question of intangible heritage? And if you could state your name and...
some things that people see in our community when an industry closes is not the fact that there's the architectural clock tower. The clock tower is important because it keeps time, but it's also things like the fact that the whistle indicated the fact that the factory opened and the factory closed. So for many people, the whistle, the sound of the hiss of the steam, the roar of the fire, the heat of the fire, and sometimes the dust of the dirt is the intangible that was significant to the place. Once all that's gone, all of that significance is gone. So it's a matter of how we capture some of those intangibles that relate not necessarily to Indigenous people, but to the workers, their families, the trade that went on in those places.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Anna Highland. And I don't know Anna. Oh, great, you're here. So, Anna. So, Helen, do you want to answer this one?
Yes, I'll have a go at answering this one. Look, I think the Burra Charter very strongly advocates for a cautious approach and an inclusive approach. You know, we've got the classic do as much as necessary and as little as possible. You know, those sort of terms don't favour one value at the expense of other values. The Burra Charter is, I think, trying its best to give practitioners guidance on all those things. But I suppose for me, one area which I still struggle with is the notion that cultural significance is embodied in the place itself. And I think we've seen in recent times a lot of discussion about where cultural significance actually is and our understanding of cultural significance. And I wonder if the Burra Charter might perhaps need to give us more guidance on understanding that values are attributed to a place by people rather than being inherent in the place. So therefore the sort of cultural construct that that person comes from, the eyes that they're looking at the place with, is imbuing the site with cultural values. And I think with that understanding in mind, it's quite hard as a practitioner because we can try and do what the Burra Charter tells us to understand all the values, but it's hard to understand all the values, and I'm thinking of Indigenous values, and I'm sure Meg would like to comment on this, but I think, it's impossible for us to understand a value system that's been handed down from generation to generation and has to do with the whole of country when we're coming to look at one place with a particular set of cultural eyes. So I wonder if, because the Burra Charter is trying to get us to acknowledge all values, and I suppose the related issue is that we're looking at a snapshot of values at that time, and we know that values change over time. So I think that's one area that we could consider more advice to practitioners.
Now, Meg, do you want to comment? Because it seems to me there may be certain sites where heritage values are attributed to a place based on settlement, but they may, by keeping certain things, may actually harm a community that was there previously.
Yes, I think that's certainly true in some instances, and probably the reverse is true as well in others. So it's really very, very complex, and I think that the other thing that's really kind of, and I'm not sure this is really answering your question, but that is a bit relevant perhaps from some of what you were saying, Helen, and also what Miles was saying earlier about the way the Burra Charter sits alongside heritage regimes, which kind of affects our practice on a day-to-day basis. So we're kind of working in this dichotomous environment of a sort of again from an archaeological perspective and Aboriginal archaeology in Victoria, we have legislation, whether you love it or not, that really does give Indigenous people a say in their places. And at the same time, we're kind of, as practitioners, trying to work with the principles of gathering as much information as possible about a place to inform the practice that goes into the management of that place. So I think that the heritage regime sort of sitting alongside of the Burra Charter is also something that can cause issues in relation to the sort of the ongoing management of places.
Miles? Yeah.
I think it's a very important point that was made, the idea that the values change and are attributed by people, not inherent in the place. I think trouble relating that back to the question itself. I accept that, say, the Burra Charter preserving a piece of European structure on a sacred site may be perpetuating harm, but the Burra Charter doing harm is a problem to me. The Burra Charter normally is keeping something, not doing something. Essentially, the only people who suffer that way are developers who lose opportunity costs. And I'm considered for them, so I'm not sure about the site actually doing harm. I find it very puzzling. Perhaps the question
There is this attitude that we're not doing anything, we're just saying we're going to do something. But that is doing something. That is preserving that area and possibly putting pressure onto another area. That is preserving that fabric and possibly preserving fabric that is not as expressed on.
Okay, that's the point. Perpetuating harm, not doing it.
Yeah.
So I think we can comfort ourselves in saying that we're passive, but we are active in the negotiation of that environment.
James?
I agree with that. It's a very interesting point, and I think we start kind of unpicking some of the assumptions again that lie beneath the Charter itself. Or the Charter assumes that conserving places with some degree of change, or perhaps known as kind of a universal good. It's a universal public and social good to conserve places. It's a positive activity, it's a progressive activity as well, and will kind of automatically lead to better outcomes for an envisioned public at large. And that's because that's what people like David Rankin and others came at it with. And conservation may be all those things. It may well not be. And maybe in some cases it's not some kind of blurs in the middle. I think so we kind of take conservation to be quite a contested activity, even among people who are all in favour of conserving places. We also know conservation can be instrumentalised, used for any political purpose as well by whoever kind of wants to do that. So, and even among the profession, we even have differing views about that. So, to strictly apply the Burra Charter, perhaps to take on a set of underlying assumptions, and it assumes that, again, as you say, harm can't happen from the Burra Charter, even though we know that it can, because it always overlaps with other concerns and considerations within political, social, economic. So, for example, we know gentrification and conservation, they go hand in hand. And I'm sure we're also very familiar with the guns for hire refrain as well. So I think what this means is to take conservation to be kind of this political activity rather than a neutral activity means we need to spend more time thinking about and asking these questions about the ethics of conservation. And then once we start thinking about the ethics of conservation, we can try our best to avoid harm as best as we can in the application of the Charter.
Yep. Helen.
Could I just add to that too? Because I think indirectly we cause harm by using the Burra Charter and in fact the Statement of Significance particularly to reinforce particular narratives. And recently I've been looking at a house in Brighton that a woman who wasn't an architect actually arranged to have partly built herself, and then she was a journalist, she wrote about it, publicised it, and it got me thinking about how few women's narratives we have, and for that you can substitute many other minority groups. And I think while the Burra Charter sets out to be inclusive, the practical application, for example, of writing a statement of significance and the poor old council going to the ends of the earth to actually get it there in their planning scheme with the good intention of protecting a place, means that these things don't get updated and changed, and then decisions are made looking back at that initial significance understanding. And I think it does risk, and in fact often perpetuates, particular streams in our narrative, and it's quite important for us to challenge that and try and broaden and look to the stories that we're not telling. Are they already there in our places, or are there other places that we need to look for? And I don't think that that's at odds with what the Burra Charter wants us to do, but it is perhaps sometimes at odds. It's perhaps indirect harm that comes out of the practice.
So do we have anyone from the floor that would like to add to that conversation? No. So our next question is from David Rhodes. David here. So I'm going to pretend to be David. Just believe me. So during my work as a heritage consultant, I'm constantly receiving feedback about the Burra Charter from Aboriginal heritage organisations. One criticism that is frequently made is to the effect that the criteria for significance assessment in the Burra Charter are more relevant to non-Aboriginal heritage places. In other words, that the Charter is not culturally relevant to Aboriginal people. I've also found the criterion for significance assessment particularly difficult to apply to Aboriginal places, tangible and intangible. Is there any intention to review the criterion for significance assessment in the Charter to increase its relevance to Aboriginal Australians? I feel that if this doesn't happen, the Burra Charter will slowly cease to have relevance for Aboriginal people as they move forward to reclaim their heritage. This looks like a question for Megan directly.
Yes, I think we've touched on a number of these points tonight already. Look, I think that the change that we've seen in the Burra Charter over the years, particularly the turning point around 1999, certainly means that there is more capacity for Aboriginal cultural heritage values to be managed, dealt with, recorded within the Charter framework. And certainly there's been a lot of work done, particularly at the practice note level, within the Charter that improves potentially improves people's understanding about how to really apply the principles of the Charter in the realm of Indigenous cultural heritage. Certainly the specific kind of definitions of cultural significance that are in the Charter, aesthetic, historic, scientific, social, or spiritual, whether you agree with spiritual or not, certainly has the capacity or the breadth to encompass Aboriginal cultural heritage values. But I think that the biggest issue, again, here is something I said before, is more about the application. So it's more about the data gathering, the information gathering that occurs, and the sort of inherent tensions there that surround Indigenous cultural heritage recording. As I said previously, there's the old heritage regime that's sitting on top of sort of a lot of the day-to-day practice that archaeologists are undertaking, say, within Victoria, but across the country as well, that dictates a lot of the sort of the practice, the way we go about our work. So having the Charter sort of sitting parallel to that kind of contributes to it, but we also have quite prescribed processes that we have to follow to gather information. I see that these can weave together really quite well because the principles are pretty much the same, but the problem, I think, is in the archaeological industry particularly is that we're just not very good at looking at these broader values. We're not very good at looking at the intangible values. So even at the outset, we're not necessarily recording the breadth of values that we need to be recording to really make a kind of much more coherent and idealised or a better approach to managing Aboriginal cultural heritage. And this brings in all sorts of other aspects like the whole the natural landscape, cultural landscape aspect as well. And at an archaeological level, we're very, very focused on fabric, and so we kind of have a lot of difficulty stepping out of that. Some archaeologists more than others are able to kind of straddle this area, but it is a really big challenge for our industry. The other side of that is that there are not a lot of Indigenous people who are working in the industry at a sort of archaeological level, or that has improved over the years. And so we're getting a lot of, we're starting to develop an industry where there are Indigenous practitioners who are really kind of getting out there and making their mark. But by the same token, they're actually still constrained if you're working on a day-to-day basis in cultural heritage management with Aboriginal cultural heritage, say in Victoria, you are constrained by the sort of the economic and requirements of providing a service to your client under the current heritage regime. Then to the point of whether it can become more relevant, particularly when we're looking at the development of the statements of significance. I think again that really comes down to the data that comes into it and the effort that we put into as practitioners to really capture what the breadth of values are at a particular place. And I think that the Charter has some room to move there. I'm not aware of any intentions of, say, Australia ICOMOS, any intentions of changing this side of the Charter, getting to the part of the question of whether there is an intention to change it to improve Indigenous, the criteria for Indigenous cultural heritage. But I think that there's certainly some room to improve in terms of the actual practice, definitely.
Miles?
I'm a bit with no Aboriginal expertise, but I see sites which I can see the Charter applying to directly, bark trees and stone circles and scooped out waterholes and so on. I don't see any big problem with that. Then there's a category of these ones, the harm issue, where a European site is overlaid an Aboriginal one. But the Charter provides for that. It provides for conflicting values. It doesn't in the end say how you resolve and who's going to win. I mean, the consultant has to do that. It has to be exposed publicly and criticised. The Charter doesn't say, what's going to be the final outcome. But it is fully allowed for in the Charter. The big problem is the Charter processes are public and they're scrutinised publicly. That's how you keep consultants up to date and keep dealing with these changing values. The problem with the Aboriginal heritage is a lot of it is not public. So you get people saying, this has been sacred all the time, we didn't tell you what to keep secret. Or, this has been secret to men only, or to women only, until now. There's even a case, I think, recently in New South Wales, where two Aboriginal experts are saying, this place is significant, the other saying, not significant. I mean, unless you can get the evidence publicly, I can't see how the Charter process is going to work at this site.
I mean, that is a really big challenge. There are lots of issues with the way that the practice occurs, speaking to the right people who can actually speak for places, so knowledge holders, definitely it's a really big issue. And the other, of course, is just the effects of colonisation, the loss of information, and sort of the recovery of information as well that goes on. So it's a kind of, it's just a really, really complex sort of space to be working in, definitely.
Helen?
I wanted to just highlight, I think, Miles, you're talking about specific places or more easily defined aspects of Indigenous culture, and I can see the application there. I think what I struggle with is the bigger cultural understanding of the stories across country, and I know when I was on the Australian Heritage Council, we were trying to look at how we could actually involve some of these sea stories, for example, in being recognised in registers, and it's really quite hard when it's not defined as certain places. It's actually a story across a bigger landscape, and I just wanted to draw a parallel because probably most people have looked at the historic urban landscape approach, the whole approach that's being used in Ballarat, but I'm finding there's parallels there. It's quite interesting to see a city not as an area that, you know, normally we might draw a boundary around, but as a sort of dynamic, complex, changing landscape. And I wonder if there's more room in terms of thinking about Indigenous landscapes and complex cultural landscapes in a similar fashion that might be different from specific places.
James, can you add to that?
Just to add, I think that's an excellent point made by Helen, is that the Burra Charter itself, it is a Western heritage charter. It was a reworking in many ways of Venice Charter, even if it rejected some of its terminology. And I think to make kind of a dramatic kind of leap forward in terms of philosophy, well, we would need a philosophy that both draws on Western and Indigenous forms of knowledge at its kind of core. And I don't think we have that yet, but we've kind of reached or anywhere really near that point at the moment. But maybe one day we'll get a philosophy.
Kate. It does. It does. Anyone else like to add to this discussion? So our next question is another one from Anna. And I've been asked to say this is a question about heritage practice at a general level rather than relating to the Burra Charter.
I guess so.
Mm. Or another way of putting it, I've got your question here too. Is it time to incorporate broader questions of social, economic and environmental sustainability within heritage practice?
I don't know much about this area, but I'm just thinking that there's some, probably when I was working with Borough particularly, some really strong parallels from at their end about heritage practice and caring for country. Not exactly what we're talking about, but sort of I think to the side that's similar. So I think that definitely that is something that that they were thinking about, and others, such as the time when I was talking about country, cultural practices, water, all sorts of things, have cultural sort of manifestations. And so in terms of actual management practices, thinking about how country can be cared for at the same time was certainly something that people were thinking about when I was involved with those organisations. I don't know whether I'm not sure if that really answers your question. Certainly not in relation to the Burra Charter.
I think it does answer the question in a sense because it's about the local application system. If the Burra Charter is supporting that, then that's
Or is another way to ask it, are questions of sustainability, social, economic and environment, are they actually inherent within the notion of heritage practice anyway, and in the Burra Charter? Possibly. Yes.
My answer to that is no. I've said before my view about this. There are all sorts of factors which are opposed to conservation, which compete with conservation. They may be economic and they may be developmental and so on. And I think it's best that they be explored publicly, and you can vote on it, take it to the election, whatever it may be. Sustainability may be totally antithetical to conservation. It may well be you're preserving a site using scarce timbers to restore a building, and you're creating something which is, in energy terms, disastrous for conservation reasons. And you have to assess whether the conservation benefit of that is worth the cost in terms of sustainability, and that should be a public debate. Putting it inside the charter, that makes it harder to deal with. It should be outside the charter.
James?
I disagree with Miles. And I think that, and I've got kind of a little bit of a long answer, I'll put my historical hat for a little bit as well. But I think that social, economic, and environmental issues are inherently part of conservation in the same way as they're part of architecture, they're part of planning, they're part of urban policy. If we look back at the ministerial Burra Charter, well, they operated through mid-20th century ideologies to the city and to conservation. They operated through ideas about urban and architectural modernism, and they were in favour of, in various ways, rebuilding of the nation and the city as of war and post-war reconstruction. There was a particular appetite for newness and expertise, and that had a particular place for heritage in the old, and that would be managed in a very particular and very specific and very deliberate way. And the Burra Charter in particular is kind of a response to that era of how we should deal with new and old. But our contemporary understandings and approaches to heritage must similarly be adapted to today's ideologies and pressing environmental and social challenges. So just back then, the enemy of heritage was always seen to be things that were new, development and change. That was perceived to be the enemy of heritage. But I think we've kind of moved beyond that thinking, that kind of old-fashioned oppositional thinking. And I think perhaps and maybe I'm not alone in this, the enemy of preservation today is more neglect and indifference than anything else. So let's talk about indifference, and I'm going to stand on my soapbox for a little bit. It's often been said in these kinds of forums that younger people are not interested in conservation as they kind of once were. And so that's not been my experience, but that's only when we start expanding our thinking of what conservation is and what it can be beyond kind of buildings and beyond fabric, and in parallel to that, also engaging with means and different forms of associations to place. So those associations and the forms of significance can be architectural, they can be through planning cultures, they can also be through kind of artistic and civic cultures or other things as well. And through sustainability and climate change too, it can often be better to keep, or generally better to keep an older building than to demolish it. And in order to kind of keep support in place for conservation, in order to keep community support in place for conservation, government support for conservation for what we do, well, we need to kind of think about conservation in these kind of different kind of ways. Because at the end of the day, we may, if we don't kind of start to think about it in these broader terms, well, all we'll really be doing is looking after a few major historic monuments, and that's it. And then other people may well look after other things, or they may not. So I think that our mission today is to be part of kind of a broader, larger public shift towards valuing heritage and conservation places in a broader sense. I think I saw on Twitter today, Historic Scotland has just teamed up with the Climate Heritage Network, and that's the kind of big move in Scotland at the moment. But also closer to home, as we've seen, Citizen Heritage with Beaumaris Modern, with the Palace Theatre, or with Federation Square. This is kind of already happening in the community right now, that there are different forms of kind of relationship to place in relation to heritage forming. So I think we should kind of proactively engage with that as well. So.
And perhaps I could add to that and say I agree very much with what James is saying, although I would say it in a very non-academic way and say we can't stay in our silo called heritage off to the side if we want to be relevant and be out there. And I think having culture and heritage added to the Sustainable Development Goals actually gave a platform right around the world for people to push agendas, to get funding, to raise the profile of heritage. So I think we really need to be a part of all these related movements. Otherwise we risk being left to the side and missing the boat.
Now, would anyone like from the floor to add to the discussion about, yes, and if you could state your name and then the question.
From the city of Yarra, I come from a council's perspective where we have a lot of heritage in our council, and also it's a council where a huge amount of development is taking place, and there is a constant struggle between the community and the council about the level of growth on heritage properties. So I'm just wanting to know, through this discussion of Burra Charter, will there be aspects of its practice looked into, and how we can better protect or avoid some of the conflicts which we are seeing in the community at this point? And these conflicts are arising mainly out of economic growth and what the economy brings to the place. So although there are individually significant and state significant sites, there are huge amounts of developments taking place on the heritage sites. So that is the issue which the council and the community is facing now. And I think that is most of the inner Melbourne council's issue. I'm just wondering whether this discussion will be some practice modification or more advocacy or more education or training.
Yeah, I think it's really good that you make that point, and just for a moment putting my ICOMOS hat on and looking around and saying, I hope everyone here is an ICOMOS member. The Burra Charter actually resides with ICOMOS, and the process of changing or developing guidelines is very driven by active ICOMOS members. So I suppose what I'd say is we're very conscious of these issues, and one of the great things that Adam has done in raising these sort of events, which are going to take place in a number of states across Australia, is to get people thinking about what we want and what we need. And the changes that have happened before have been done and led by certain people, but they've sort of risen from comments from the membership and suggestions from the membership and workshops and things like that. So I suppose I would put it back to the audience and say it's up to us. If we feel there are strong issues and ways we want to see the Burra Charter, or in fact the companion documents to the Burra Charter respond to these, we've got every opportunity to tackle it and raise it and work through it as a group. And it would be good to feel that something might come out of these discussions that leads to some new thinking, even if it doesn't change the Burra Charter itself.
So, James?
Just a kind of a direct response to the specific about that kind of conflict in the inner suburbs. And I live in Brunswick, So I see it. I live in one of those apartment blocks in Brunswick, so I see it all the time. I think that we've got to accept that that development is part of urban growth and urban life in Australia. And I think what that means is that we're not going to be able to necessarily conserve fabric in the ways that we may necessarily want to through this change. But I think it's also our way to start thinking more broadly about heritage and more broadly about conservation, because we can be at that kind of core area around questions around placemaking and bring in historical and bring in heritage ways of thinking into that. And through those kind of placemaking processes, through design or through interpretation and other ways on these development sites, where we can actually add depth of meaning to place and work with the community in that way, even if we can't necessarily prevent the construction of these apartment blocks and probably nor should we.
So we've got time for one last question, and I think Julian, Sue or Ian was going to ask the question. Yeah. Ian Travers. Slightly, and this is why I wanted to. Do you want me to ask it for you? But I can ask it for you. How should the Burra Charter interface with local heritage guidelines and controls? It is referenced in most, but rarely applied in a literal sense. And it does relate back to your question in this discussion about the Burra Charter. So I was wondering whether any of the panel had an answer. We've heard from James. So how should the Burra Charter interface with local heritage guidelines and controls?
If I could comment on that, because I'm always amused when I go to VCAT or some sort of hearing and you hear both sides of the argument claim very proudly, we're following the Burra Charter, you know. And I think, what does that actually mean? What are those people saying when they're trying to put that forward? And what do councils mean when they say, you know, we're adopting Burra Charter as best practice? And I think often what people are saying is that they're adopting the Burra Charter process of understanding significance and then applying that in policies and in management. And I think that we should go on encouraging that process to be there. But I think it is quite hard to see how actual guidelines can adopt specific sections of the Burra Charter, because, as Miles has just said before, it allows room for contested meanings, for different views on the extent of change.
Which is part of its robustness. It's
yes.
Why it's been a robust document, because of that ability
yes.
to.
It does mean that we start from the same point often of saying, well, what is significant? And taking that guide out. And I think that's very valuable. But I think it's harder for it to actually be written in as a guideline, particularly for local government, because people will see it differently.
Yes, at the back. Thank you.
The other thing is that the heritage conservation is to do with conserving what has happened previously. Okay, but as we proceed, more things have happened. Okay, so there's a lot more has happened than when I first started in the 1980s. And these things, of course, need to be brought in under the umbrella of the Charter. And that's really the updating process, which I think is critical. And the 2013 Charter is very concise and direct to the issues we confront today. But no doubt there'll be reason to bring other things forward in the future.
Thank you. And a comment here.
management side of these values and comments from the panel on whether we can increase guidance or practice notes around the management of specific values. So I think that we've been very good over the years at managing architectural values or aesthetic values, for example, but do we have the body of work to support how we might manage social values or some of the other values that have been talked about tonight?
Well, our panel. Anyone like to try that one?
I think,
yeah.
I think we would all agree with you that we need to keep building our expertise to manage these sort of values. And I'm, again, not sure that the Burra Charter is going to be the place to do that, because I think maybe we need to put quite a bit of work into thinking through like a practice note and then try and refine things and how these things are managed. But I think even despite that, what the Burra Charter does says that those values are important and do have to be in policy and do have to be managed. And you know, not so long ago, some of those values weren't getting that recognition. So I think it is, the Burra Charter is evolving, and maybe we need to catch up in many ways, but at least it's giving recognition to some of those things.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap it up very soon. So, Miles, James, who's going to battle it out for the final say? Miles.
I was just going to, on that same point in the previous question, the Burra Charter is principally a document for professionals and consultants like people in this room. Basically, when they produce their results, the local government authorities get to adopt them or not. It's yet to be very rarely need to be used by the authority itself. They get to get the results of their expert advisors. The management is quite a different issue from what the charter process does. And then the charter may arise again when there's an appeal or some new decision to be made. But that's the decision-making time, not the planning time, not the laying down the details of a local scheme or issuing the permits.
Well, I'm going to wrap things up now. I think it's been a fantastic discussion, and in many ways a celebration of just over 40 years, I think that's, of the Burra Charter, in which time I think it has proved itself to be remarkably robust and still valid, and really a testament to the Australian heritage profession, initiated by Miles and others, and David Rankin, and who have kept it going and have still kept it vital, and many of our colleagues here and interstate who are still fighting the good fight internationally, I think, on the behalf of heritage and conservation. The other thing I'd like to do is to thank Adam, who's been the mastermind of the whole event this evening. It's been terrific, Adam. Thank you so much. But I'd like to thank our panellists, Meg Goulding, Helen Lardner, Miles Lewis and James Lesh. So thank you very much. And we have some refreshments out in the foyer, I understand, so please join us. And also, please feel free to take a copy of David Rankin's book. He would love it very much if they all went. Thank you.
Teapot. You have to take a teapot.
Oh, what, sorry?
It's an indigenous teapot.
Have you really?
Thanks so much for your observation.